everyone, and thanks for joining us in another episode of Supporting Family Resilience, Community Voices, Community Perspectives. I'm Deb Ottman, the host of this podcast series, and today I am so happy to welcome a colleague of mine, Karla Sorby Decker. Karla is going to be speaking to us as the tribal nurse consultant who oversees 11 different sites for the Minnesota Department of Health. She is also a member of the Dakota Nation from the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate community in North and South Dakota, and she is also the parent of 3 children. And will bring her experiences and perspectives in all of those roles as she shares her insight and wisdom with us today. So thank you so much for being here today, Karla. I'm welcome.
Thank you, Deb. It is an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for your warm welcome.
Absolutely. So let's get started. As we know, this podcast series has been aimed at just helping all of us understand what we mean by resilience and how we can better support folks in that. And so in your own words, what does this word resilience or resiliency mean to you? And I guess more specifically, I'd like to know what brought you to this definition and how might it relate to the field you're in?
Great questions. Well, I've been a nurse for 40 years, and most of that time I've worked in the parenting support and education field. And as you said, currently I'm the tribal nurse consultant at the Minnesota Department of Health in the family home visiting section. Mm-hmm. My role is to support all 11 of our state's tribal nations, as well as the counties and nonprofits providing maternal child health services to American Indian pregnant people and families with preschool children. These services are intensive and long-term, ideally lasting from pregnancy until the child's 3rd to 5th birthdays. So, in my experience as a nurse in this field, and from personal hardships, I have thought a lot about what helps us overcome difficult life events. I guess another way you could say it is what helps people build resiliency. And, first I'll share that I believe that resiliency is an important skill that can be learned. It's not something you're born with like brown eyes. Resiliency is really important because this is the skill that helps us from getting overwhelmed and paralyzed and defeated and turning to unhealthy coping mechanisms. When I had a chance to return to university in my 50s to earn a master's degree, I studied resiliency and I learned a lot about what science says. But at the end of the day, I have to say most everything I really know in my bones about resiliency can be boiled down to what I learned from others, from their actions and stories about what resiliency is. When I started working with Minnesota tribal nations a decade ago, Mr. Vince Rock was one of the first folks I met. He's a nursing director at one of our northern tribes, and he's quite friendly and accepting, and so I felt really comfortable asking him, what can I do in this role that would be important to help our families that are experiencing such challenges? He said he'd think on it and get back to me. And sure enough, a few days later, he was back in my office. He pulled out a notepad and he set it on the table. On the page was written one word in capital letters: hope. He explained that whatever I did, whatever program, funding, training, strategy I offered his community, it had to be something that would bring hope if it were going to make a difference. And that resonated with me because one of the things I learned in 20 plus years of being a family home visitor was the importance of hope. The evidence-based programs MDH funds are rigorously studied models that provide parents education about their child's development, about the importance of building structure and routines. Family home visitors teach communication skills and work with participants to find resources in their communities. We work to build self-awareness and self-esteem through the success of setting and achieving goals, and we cheer like hell when goals are achieved.
Yeah.
Family home visiting embodies the parallel process. What educator Jerry Paul says is doing unto others as you would have others do unto others. So we role model healthy communication and problem solving. We empathize with what our participants are going through, but we strive to teach them to see things from a different perspective and apply those problem solving skills.
There's so much that you've shared right here. I wish we had 4 hours to talk about it. First of all, I really appreciate the notion of bringing in parallel process and the way our emotions impact the next relationship we have, and that in turn, those emotions can impact subsequent relationships. So that chain reaction, and having a chain reaction that is embedded and founded in hope is such a wise and really growth promoting place to start. And so I think the thing that I'd like to ask you about related to this and related to how hope feeds into resilience, especially as you are dealing with people that have historically been, at the hands of the colonizers, made to feel as hopeless as possible. How do, and this might be a kind of a self-apparent answer to the question, but how does giving parents this information about structure and information about education and communication skills, how does it instill hope in families that have been so greatly challenged and experiencing so many layers of trauma?
I think the main thing is really it's just showing people that there can be a different way. We are in the middle of a challenge and a struggle or a difficult life event, and that is all we can see. That is all we can feel. And having someone to walk that path with us helps us to see that it can be different, helps us to understand and to know that this isn't the way it maybe will always be.
I love that. That sometimes we can help be the person that's shining the light on that end of the tunnel that maybe someone who's in such despair or under such stress can't see. And that we do that through our pairing and through our relationship with those adults and those families. That's lovely.
My a coworker of mine who is just an avid reader has shared a quote with me about books that say books are either windows or mirrors. Mm-hmm. And I kind of think this work is the same way. It's a window to a better life, or it's a mirror for self-reflection. And it's probably both.
I have heard that quote about books because I love to read many times. But I've never thought about that as applied to this work, and I think that could be a new T-shirt. I agree with you 100%. And the notion that we can help families feel hopeful about seeing a different way, a way that may feel better, and bring about greater emotional stability is a very hopeful thing. And so your mentor's word is absolutely brilliant and wise, and something I think that it's good for all of us to recall. So as I think about your work and the going into a family's home through home visiting, which I think, number one, it's a very humbling job for the home visitor to be allowed into kind of the sacred space of a family, into their home. And that can be a very vulnerable thing for them to do, and which in and of itself can be a challenge or, make people feel a little less secure. So as you think about this past year, and the challenge, actually now a couple of years, that all the challenges that COVID has presented, not to mention on top of some of these other big stressors, what are the challenges that most impact a caregiver's ability to call upon their resilience? And as you look ahead, what are the potential areas that you feel may continue to be a struggle for families.
Where do you even begin to explain the depth of changes and challenges that families have faced during the past 2 years, right?
Right.
The bottom line is that many families lost their connections, their support systems, their safety networks. And these are key elements of resiliency.
Right.
And those were limited or even gone completely.
Mm-hmm.
And it may take time to reconnect with our families and to rebuild those relationships. Families tell me the things they're struggling with now most are food insecurity. I mean, my goodness, I have a mom who can't even, I don't see families anymore. So I hear this secondhand, of course, through my home visitors. But, they're saying their families can't even get infant formula to supplement if they're not able to exclusively breastfeed. And so there's food insecurity, even for infants, and financial concerns. My goodness, we have double-digit inflation.
Right.
They're navigating the stress on top of dealing with an incredible child care, teacher shortage, social unrest, and really, an underlying divisiveness in our communities and in our country. Families feel sometimes so overwhelmed by it all, they hardly know where to start. A tribal educator and family home visitor I work with shared a story with me about helping families navigate tough times. And she tells it from the story of wisdom that's embedded in family home visiting. Only a small change is necessary.
Can you share the story?
Yeah. So in her story, she tells of a family that she worked with that had a busy and chaotic household. I mean, right? You can imagine. There's a larger extended family living in the home. And like so common nowadays, everyone existed on energy drinks and soda. Kids weren't sleeping well and had behavior problems. She talked to them about simply substituting water for the bottle drinks and helped them to make a simple goal to have refrigerated water available, and everyone would just replace just one sugared beverage with water each day. They really were motivated because they wanted the kids to sleep better and decided that they would do this at the evening meal. They all shared an evening meal as a family, and it wouldn't be missed as much because they were eating, right? So they wouldn't miss the sugary drink. There was some pushback, sure, but the argument was that it was just one time that you'd be drinking water. Well, you can probably guess the experiment went so well, they started having cold water more often. They quit refrigerating the soda and the other drinks, so the cold water became actually more appealing. And within 2 months, the family quit buying those beverages completely and now only serve water and dairy-free milk to the whole family. The kids and adults are sleeping better. Grandma's diabetes is greatly improved. Wow. And it all started with just one small change. If the home visitor had said this would be the end goal, like just not going to have any of this in the house, it might have been met with much resistance. However, but by keeping that goal small, it was easier to get everyone to adapt and buy in. It was one small change that made a difference. And is this resiliency? I'm not sure. But I do know the process of goal setting to achieve a desired outcome is a skill needed to weather tough times.
Well, I love that. And I think that, yes, it is so to answer, is this resiliency? I know you asked that rhetorically, but it is the start of building those skills. As you said, no one's born with it. It's something we learn, we practice. And this, for me, reminds me of one of the kind of the principles of when we work with families and young children is that we don't start with the end. We join families with where they are. And we build that trust and we walk alongside them to help get them where we would hope that they'll find themselves to be, and that it's something that they want on their own. And so this little story that you shared is, I think, so brilliant because, yep, you're right. She could have started with the end goal and saying, I'm the expert. I know this is going to work, but no, that's not how it works. And there's a lot of rich wisdom in this anecdote. So thank you for sharing that. As you think about the home visitors who are working with the caregivers and primarily parents or extended family, I'm wondering what you are hearing from those that are going into the homes about how children might be currently impacted by the challenges their important adults are facing.
Oh, yes, exactly. And home visitors from around the state have shared that as challenging as this pandemic is and the related chaos has been for adults, it's even more so for children.
Mm-hmm.
Change and unpredictability, of course, can be stressful for anyone, but for children, change and disruption of routine is especially stressful.
Mm-hmm.
Schools across the U.S. were abruptly shut down, moving many children to hybrid or distance learning. Parents maybe were now no longer working from the office and losing those social connections. They were working from home or maybe even lost their job. Stay-at-home orders, resulted in kids becoming socially isolated from friends and extended family, and it kept them from participating in their normal activities. As children moved to distance learning and daycare centers were closed, they lost the supports and services that supported their academic, their physical, their social, and even their psychological well-being. Absolutely. The impact of those losses has been significantly compounded for children with disabilities, children living in poverty, and living in under-resourced communities. And I would say even in rural areas where I live, I'm up in Bemidji.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not as easy to get to the centers and the places that would typically you'd be able to access here in the metro area. And even if some of those services exist in greater Minnesota where, we might be able to access it online, but that's it. So absolutely. I think I appreciate you bringing up that point because too frequently we tend to leave those rural areas out of the conversation. And that in and of itself can be a challenge or a barrier. So thank you for bringing that up. So I think it's pretty clear that you and others are seeing the compound effects that the pandemic and all these other societal issues and ills that you raised are impacting our littlest people. So what's the answer as we the helpers who are working within systems designed to provide the help? What do we need to think about in working with families? And more importantly, what might we be doing differently?
Yeah, great question. So, people that I work with providing the direct services and supports to families tell me that it's important to provide their services in a trauma-informed way, right? To promote and teach resiliency. And in my field, that approach might include the first step of just simply understanding and acknowledging what parents and families are experiencing. However, while it's incredibly important to recognize those challenges, research tells us that we cannot fix the problem by focusing on it. Like, what? But it is true. We cannot fix the problem by focusing on it. If you've worked in this field for any amount of time, you've probably heard about ACEs or adverse childhood experiences, yeah? And you know that the research is extensive around the lasting impact of ACEs on our physical and mental health for the rest of our lives. The more ACEs, the greater the impact.
Right.
But however, experts in the field of child abuse prevention tell us that we're really missing half the story if we don't focus on benevolent childhood experiences, or BCEs. They don't get enough airtime. Higher levels of BCEs, including growing up with at least one safe caregiver, having one or more close friends, and having structure and a home routine, predict better mental health in adulthood, even when there's ACEs present. I think it's really empowering for parents to know that even in our world where there is so much uncertainty and stress, the relatively small things they can do for their child, like simply having a bedtime routine, can really mitigate the long-term effects their child might experience during stressful times. The research says that focusing on strengths gives much better results than focusing on deficits.
Absolutely.
It is easier to help people do more of what they're doing right than it is for us to help them to do less of what they're doing wrong. It's also empowering for families to hear what they're doing right. I visited with a brand new home visitor not so long ago who told me of a story of a participant she was working with. The family experienced many challenges, and the home visitor was able to direct them to several resources that would be a great fit. But as you can imagine, the paperwork and applying for some of the sports was really overwhelming for the family, and they just didn't follow through. But at one visit, the family shared that they had been able to finish a SNAP application and get food support. They told her that just alone took so much stress off the family just to have more food in the home. The home visitor said, I was nearly in tears to see cooking going on and milk in the fridge, and I was so excited. And I told the mom, I'm so proud of you. And she started crying. And the home visitor said, I thought I had said something wrong, and I started to apologize, but she stopped me and she said, no. No one ever told me they were proud of me for anything before. It just feels good.
Oh.
The home visitor said she learned a fundamental lesson about the real nature of our work that day. Look for strengths, celebrate strengths, and share resources.
Right.
These are some of the things that give us hope when we're struggling. My mother-in-law is an 88-year-old Ojibwe woman still living off the family land, just off the Red Lake Nation. We were recently invited to her home for dinner. She's making her beloved roast beef. As we helped her to clean up, we noticed the 1970s electric skillet she had used to prepare it in. It was missing one handle and one set of legs, and it needed to be propped up on one side by a 12-inch 2x4 board. My husband gently chided her, this woman can definitely afford a new one, yet she said it still worked and she saw no reason to replace it. Though as a side note, she did graciously accept the new one we gifted her for Mother's Day. My mother-in-law did not have an easy childhood, yet she went on to run the entire communications department for a Fortune 500 company as a little American Indian gal from Shoto, Montana.
Wow.
She's one of the most resilient people I know, and I was reminded that resiliency might look different than what we expect. It might look like stubbornness in an old electric skillet. Sometimes strength might look misguided, right? Sometimes the crazy things people do were actually healthy and adaptive to trauma at the time, but they since lost their usefulness. So understanding that allows us to look for resilience and honor it while helping people to develop more appropriate coping mechanisms. I had a participant one time in a parenting program that seemed to be constantly self-sabotaging herself in her efforts to stay sober. One day I asked her, why do you always seem to take the hard road? She thought for a moment and she replied, why do you assume I see two roads? It reminded me that she learns from her perspective, but I was teaching from mine.
Yeah.
There was a study several years ago by the University of Colorado in connection with the Nurse Family Partnership model of home visiting, one of the models that MDH supports. They looked at outcomes and satisfaction surveys from participants in their program based purely on how long their home visitor nurses had been in her role. So contrary to the conventional wisdom, new nurses ranked remarkably higher in both satisfaction and positive outcomes versus the seasoned nurses. At the time I read the study, I chalked it up to the enthusiasm that just comes along with being in a new role, and the nurses were certainly bringing that. But however, in my graduate studies, I learned that the actual difference was more likely attributed to something called the expert blind spot. And this is important because as parenting educators, it's really defined as becoming so accustomed to our knowledge that we lose the ability to understand the difficulties of learning a new domain of knowledge. We probably unconsciously think, well, that's just common sense, or everyone knows that. But we need to slow down and truly assess where our participants are, where our families are coming from. There's a deliberate process to this work. Remember what it's like to not know what you know now. When you're teaching problem-solving skills and strategies, you're actually teaching resiliency. Start small, build on strengths, identify those challenges, and specifically name and address those challenges. And know that as an expert, you automatically chunk your knowledge into large pieces. But in order to effectively teach these skills, you need to have to take the time to step back and break up those tasks or skills into simple components. I once worked with a participant who learned how to knit from her grandmother. At each visit, she would knit while we talked, and I didn't mind a bit. I knew it calmed her and it helped her to focus. As a minor parent coming from a very challenging family, the child protection system was also involved in her case. One day, her child protection worker called her out at a meeting over her inability to get her son to his medical appointments. The participant started to speak up to her for herself, but then she kind of just sighed and lowered her head. And the social worker continued, "You've been parenting classes for several months now. You've seen how to do it, so just do it." At that, the participant handed her the yarn and the knitting needles. And with wisdom I didn't know she had, she spoke. She said, "I know you said you didn't know how to knit, but you've been watching me for months now, so knit, damn it, just do it." And what a lesson that was, right? When I'm working with a novice in any of my roles, I always think of that story and the gentle patience and slow, small pieces of information and time to practice I would need if someone were teaching me to knit. And I'm reminded that's the approach I need to take.
Oh, gosh, Karla. One of the things I just need to emphasize and go back to in everything that you've shared here is this idea that, we frequently come in as the expert and feel that that's the only perspective we can hold in the role. And I've heard it talked about joining families where they are, but I think the added notion of the expert blind spot, when you marry those two things together, that's where the real power comes in. So I so appreciate that and the anecdote that you just shared, because that's what it boils down to, doesn't it?
It really does. It changed the way I thought about my work, and it really reminded me to slow down and be deliberate. And we give a lot of lip service to meeting families where they're at, and I have no doubt that we do that. But what does that really mean? And for me, this is what it means. I just need to remember what it's like to not know what I know now.
How to knit. Yeah. To not know how to knit. I thank you for sharing all that. So we know that frequently with many of these families that typically if a family is requiring home visitation or has requested it, there are typically enough challenges or stressors in their lives in other areas that they're receiving additional supports, and they may be working with other organizations and other departments. And so as you think about your role, coming from it as public health, but you also speak so much wearing the hat of an infant and early childhood mental health specialist. It's apparent to me that you hold these principles so closely in your work. How do you see, or what might be your words of encouragement or things to think about for other professionals working on behalf of families, but coming from other sectors? What might you say to them in terms of what are your ideas on working together or just the collaboration in terms of being able to help support and promote the overall health and resilience of a family?
Yeah, one of the resources in my field of home visiting that's been an inspiration for me is the body of work by Karlas. Mm-hmm. In her book, simply titled Home Visiting, she shares her longitudinal research about what it is that families valued most about the supports they received, whether it was from nurses, social workers, paraprofessionals, the WIC nurse. It didn't matter. It really was about the supports that they received from outside of the family. Some of the identified strategies will not be a surprise to folks working in this field. Families valued help with finding resources. They appreciated assistance with completing forms and with keeping up with deadlines and applications for services. They wanted to learn about child development and how to help their child be happy and healthy. They also valued learning communication skills and how to handle their emotions and learning problem-solving skills. Mm-hmm. I personally remember going through a very rough patch in life as a young mom. A well-meaning friend tried to comfort me by downplaying what I was going through with some common phrases we might use. It's not that bad. Yeah. Cheer up, look at the bright side, things will get better. Didn't really help that much. And while those things weren't the wrong things to say, what I really heard was that my feelings weren't valid. It was when I finally went in to talk to a professional about what I was experiencing that I learned the rest of the story. She listened and empathized. She helped me to put my feelings into words and to see my situation as a problem that had solutions. She said, it will get better, but only after she acknowledged that I had valid feelings about some challenging life events and helped me to focus on areas I could control.
Okay. Again, another really important element that before we can make progress, it reminds me of Dr. Bruce Perry's book that he just came out with Oprah Winfrey,
Yes.
The title of which is What Happened to You, which is using a trauma-informed approach and making room for that answer and making room for the emotions that come along with that answer before we can move forward beyond that. So thank you for that. I think that is, I can't think of a better way to move into the next question, which is, from your perspective and from all the work you've done all these years, is there anything beyond what you've already shared that you would most like professionals to know as you think about the communities with whom you work, specific to the Native American community, but really for any family with young children that may be experiencing trauma or stress? It's not related to just one particular community. Is there anything that you feel beyond what you've already mentioned that you'd like to add?
Well, as part of my academic work in resiliency, I've collected stories from some incredible people about their experiences with challenging life situations. It's a very cultural slant, right? An oral society that explains life through our stories. And these stories show that the people gain strength through a multitude of sources. And I have 3 that I'll share with you. Story number 1 is about a colleague of mine. She's a woman running a huge company's benevolent foundation in the Midwest. And she shares that she found a path out of houselessness and childhood poverty through a single after-school program when she was probably in 8th grade. Wow. It was a fun way to forget about her challenging home life. She could get out and just be a kid. That program taught her it's okay to reach out to others and ask for help. She said the program taught her it's good to look outside of yourself for answers, and she learned to look for resources along the way to help her achieve her dreams. And she now develops and funds these resources for others. Story 2, a friend of mine from the tribal college I graduated from tells me that he experienced severe depression after a childhood of unimaginable abuse. Mm-hmm. In seeking sobriety after a near-death experience, he shares that an elder told him, "You are strong enough now to be the adult that the little boy in you prayed for to protect him." Oh. He said it was a turning point, and he went from being and feeling like a victim to feeling like a person of strength. And he now holds several advanced degrees and counsels others who have experienced abuse as a child.
Wow.
And finally, the last story is about a tribal leader who works to reform the child. And this is my favorite. I can hardly talk about it without tearing up. Mm-hmm. A tribal leader who works to reform the child welfare system, or ICWA, for American Indian children, tells of her own time in foster care. The foster family didn't have much money, but the mom doted on her. She would braid her long hair and she would tell her how beautiful she was. But what really made the difference was the day the foster mom bought her a raincoat. A raincoat, she says. Imagine that. Who needs a freaking raincoat? What a splurge for this family, barely getting by. But here I was running out in the rain in a little pink plastic jacket, and I felt invincible and so special. I have never forgotten that feeling. And to this day, decades later, when I get down, I remember I'm worthy of the rain jackets in the world. So these 3 stories are about very different avenues that led people to the paths of their own resiliency, but they're common themes. And I think the main one is relationships.
Absolutely.
We say in Family Home Visiting that those relationships are the secret sauce, and we can never underestimate the value of just being genuinely available to the people we work with. Mm-hmm. I had a chance to work on a national work group examining the experience of houseless pregnant women. Several of these folks graciously allowed themselves to be interviewed, and there were many scenarios about how they arrived to what they were, and really what the barriers were to seeking resources that would help them get out of the situation. And the common thread was so surprising to me. It wasn't lack of transportation, or I don't know what the resources are. The biggest barrier, I don't feel anyone cares about me.
Oh.
That was the barrier. So the power of connection is so great.
Yes.
I think the second theme these stories is helping people to find resources. We just cannot do this work by ourselves, and connecting with others that provide support to the families we work with makes sense on so many levels.
Yes.
An elder and instructor at the tribal college I attended used to say, making strong medicine, the kind that heals, takes many hands to make. Not only do we connect our families, but we also share the heavy lift of this work when we decide we are part of the many hands that are working towards health.
Yes. Gosh, there's so many things I want to respond to, but I think I continue to go back to one of the thoughts that kicked off this conversation, and that was in sharing that in your experience and from your own training, that resilience can equate to hope. And in each of these different scenarios and the different lessons that we learned, hope is at the center of each of them. And the other thing that I think about, we talk about relationships all the time in this work and the necessity of them. But, we can have transactional relationships, and they don't have that same transformative power. And so the thing that jumped out at me as I was listening to you talk about this last little anecdote about your friend who is in foster care is the idea that through relationship, she felt seen. And it goes back to that idea of being seen, goes back to what, you were talking about when you were going through your own challenges and hearing someone acknowledge and affirm what you were feeling. It was the first time really feeling seen for you. And I think when we talk about relationship in this work, maybe one of the questions that we as helping professionals need to ask ourselves is, are we seeing the whole person here? Are we doing our best to, see with our heart as well as our mind, as our professional training asks us to? Are we seeing with the compassion of one human being to another? And I think for me, that's the transformative ingredient there. And that might be the strong medicine that is needed in the work.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. These are such beautiful stories that you have shared. And I don't know that there's anything you can add to this, but as my final question, I have two questions for you, is from where you stand in your experiences, what would you most like professionals to know? And finally, what would you most like parents and families and those important caregivers to know? Let's start with professionals.
Well, I just want to take my own advice and just acknowledge the work that professionals are doing in working with families. This is bleeding hard work. You are trying to support families in great need at a time when your own bucket might be empty. And this isn't a podcast about self-care, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention that reflective practice and a time to debrief about our work with peers and supervisors is vital. Just don't do this work alone. Like they always say, don't go swimming alone. Don't do this work alone. You can drown in it. You really can. You can quickly become overwhelmed, and you can lose sight of your own hope. It's hard work. It's the hardest work I've ever done. I would also like to remind professionals that you don't have to be perfect to be effective. You'll say the wrong thing. You'll have an off day where you can't be as attentive and focused as you'd like. But remember what families have said they find valuable. Connecting to resources, help with paperwork, learning about their child's development, learning about healthy communication and problem solving. I also think about the quote that says, I am always ready to learn, although I don't always want to be taught. It challenges us to meet families where they're at, and we've talked about this. What does that mean? And find ways to share our knowledge that isn't just us talking and lecturing. And just remember that you're making a difference even if you don't see it at the time. More research from the University of Colorado showed some staggering statistics that I would find hard to believe if they hadn't been replicated over several studies. So get this. Children whose mothers were enrolled in family home visiting were 98% less likely to be in prison at age 21 than children whose mothers were not enrolled. And the program ends when the child turns 3. So 18 years later, that effect still holds true. Think about the impact that early support and parenting education has. It is truly astounding the power we have to make a difference.
Wow. Yes. Those early relationships, that early development, I cannot overstate it enough. And I think it also points to the notion that research has shown that depending on when challenging, we all experience challenges. We all experience different varieties and degrees of trauma and setbacks in our life. But we know that in particular when it comes to children, and you pointed this out before, that protective factor is the caregiving relationship. And if we are supporting those primary caregivers during a child's first 3 years of life, I can't think of a better investment for our fellow human beings, is to make sure that those little ones are being cared for in an environment that is supportive and responsive to their needs so that they can become trusting and can learn. I've never heard that statistic, and it is astounding.
Yeah, it's been replicated, and it is specific to one model just because they funded the research, but the secret sauce that is present in that particular model is present in all of the evidence-based models that are rigorously studied.
Yes. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. So what would you like your parents and families to know, if we have any that are listening today? What's important for you to share?
There is no shame in asking for help. Quite the contrary. One key element of resiliency is being able to access and utilize resources.
Yep.
You may have to ask more than once. You may have to ask more than one person. And working in the medical profession for 4 decades, I've come to learn that the most successful people are not the ones with the highest IQs or the thickest wallets. They're the ones that are the most persistent. Be strong, be persistent. Abigail Echo Hawk is a leading American Indian researcher, and she's a poet. And she says this about resiliency in one of her poems. She says, resiliency is a myth. You just got to be a fighter. So find people who will help you fight for your family and for the life you want.
Beautiful words. Beautiful words. I'm not familiar with her as a poet, but she sounds like she's worth checking into.
Absolutely. She's just got incredible knowledge and wisdom about not just about Indigenous being and about Indigenous healing, but about healing in general. So check her out. She's got her own website, Abigail Echo Hawk.
Okay. I'm making note of that right now. So finally, as we bring this conversation to an end, I ask you to think about this both as someone who's deeply experienced in health matters, but also given your vast experience in infant and early childhood mental health principles. Is there anything else that you'd like to support or share or promote that we as the helpers can be doing to support that whole child development?
Yes, I do. I do. This is such a passionate area for me. I'm just having to force myself to try to talk more slowly. But in family home visiting, we're really big on screening. We screen for perinatal depression and child development and child social emotional development, as well as other things. But those are the key. And they're really at defined and rather frequent periodicity. So get good at screening, get good at talking about results and know who to refer to, make warm handoffs. Support parents to develop a safety net. It's hard news to learn your child has a developmental delay. I used to share the story of my cousin who's a relatively famous physician. He didn't talk until he was age 5 and he needed extensive speech therapy. Yet the man is brilliant. So this isn't about judging your child's IQ or intelligence. It's helping your child be the best they can be.
Yes.
And one last point, going back to the research by Karlas. So an additional important finding in her research is something that did surprise me, and it's that families valued another adult who took joy in their child. And I have a story about that from my own life. My first pregnancy went smoothly, but the delivery at the small rural hospital was a nightmare. He got stuck in the birth canal, and the doctor didn't know what to do, and he was essentially born dead. He was able to be revived, but he was transferred 100 miles away to the nearest neonatal intensive care unit, or NICU. A spinal tap revealed he'd had a significant brain bleed. And though he looked normal, they said it would be unlikely he would ever walk or talk. But I should take him home and just treat him as normal, but keep my expectations low. You can imagine a young mom getting that news in living in the middle of nowhere on a reservation and I had horrible postpartum depression, let's just say that, and very little support. Yeah. My spouse at the time was on the road for work and play continually, and my family lived far enough away that I didn't get to see them much. And, this was back in the day before internet and cell phones, if you can remember that or imagine that. Calling long distance that was just for rich people. We didn't have much money and my transportation was unreliable. My newborn was very jittery and he incessantly drooled. And I assumed this was from the brain damage. I focused on that and I felt like a failure. One day I was in the grocery store. A lady was looking at my baby and I thought she was going to chew me out because his bib was wet from his drooling and he looked unkempt. I braced myself for more criticism because I'd heard it plenty of times before. But instead, she smiled at me and just said with the most genuine look on her face, I couldn't help but notice his beautiful eyes. He is so adorable. Oh, I almost hate to admit this, but I really looked at my little guy for the first time. And by gosh, you know what? He did really have the most beautiful eyes. They were eyes that were alert and curious. I had a flash of understanding that he was more than his disabilities. And I won't say it was instant, but it was the start of being able to see my baby from a different point of view. I really did start treating him as a normal baby and not a baby with what I told were insurmountable birth injuries. I often think of that lady in the store. Her kind words, which seemed so authentic and affirming, changed my life. If a stranger can do that, just think what you can do as a professional working with a relationship, working with the parents.
Yeah.
I've always tried to mirror that when I've worked with families. Find authentic ways to take joy in the children you work with. Look for strengths. Praise them in front of their parents. Reframe negative behavior and help parents understand why their child does the things they do from a developmental standpoint. Help parents see that they are powerful beings shaping the future of our world. Part of resilience is knowing your power.
Yes, absolutely.
Just as a happy side note, my son did not have the catastrophic brain injuries they said he had, or if he did, he overcame them with therapy. He's a totally healthy and normal 40-year-old now, although his wife may argue the normal part, but he is a totally healthy and normal 40-year-old now with 3 children of his own.
Yeah.
You know that lady in the grocery store 40 years ago, bless her heart, was part of my and my son's journey. We will never know the impact we have on others when we do the kind thing. And in this work, you have great privilege and honor to walk this path with parents and their children. It isn't easy. It probably won't make you rich, and you might not get any awards or recognition. Yet, at the end of the day, making a difference in the life of a child is the way we leave our mark on the world, and maybe it's really the only way.
It is. I can't think of a better way to close out today's episode. I want to thank you again for joining and for sharing what I think is an episode that may be worth listening to more than once. You have given us so much to think about. Thank you, Karla.
Thank you, Deb. It was a pleasure.